A 19-year-old young man named Reggie Cole entered one of the strongest prisons in America, where he had to face the king of this prison, who was dubbed El Diablo, which means the devil. Despite the violent events that happened to Reggie in his confrontation against the devil, this confrontation eventually led to something happy that was never expected. A story with exciting events and an unexpected end. So let's watch the events of this story together. Today's story is about Reggie Cole. Reggie was still a child when his family moved to Los Angeles in 1985. They moved to a dangerous area where the crime rates and violence were rising continuously, and many gangs were operating. Reggie was the youngest brother of 2 boys and 2 girls. He was just 10 years old, and one of his older brothers, Kenny, who was 15 years old, joined one of the violent gangs in that area. With time, he began to get into big problems, and the gang he was in had skirmishes and violent armed conflicts with another gang. One day, the members of the second gang, the hostile gang, launched a surprise attack on Kenny's gang. They got into their car carrying their weapons, and they quickly stormed the area of Kenny's gang and shot at a group of them who were standing on the side of the street. Kenny was standing with them, and he was killed. After this incident, Reggie was devastated but kept trying to focus on his studies to get his mind off and try to forget what happened to his brother. His family was trying to help him overcome that hard situation he had been through. However, Reggie's environment had much more impact on him. Of course, because he was close to his late brother Kenny, he inherited his friends and acquaintances in this bad gangster world. And every year Reggie was getting away from his studies little by little until he decided to drop out and dive into the crime world following his brother's footsteps. What made the situation get even worse was the disintegration of their family and the separation of his parent. As for Reggie's brothers, his older brother, who is still alive, got a job in another city and left them. As for his 2 sisters, they got married, and each one of them lived alone with her husband. And his father, after he separated from his mother, left and lived alone in another place. No one stayed with him at home but his mother. His poor mother was not able to control him, and every day she was devastated as she saw him getting away from her more and more. His sister's husband, Reggie's brother-in-law, offered him a job in his plumbing company, but Reggie refused because he was living in another world. At that time, Reggie started to plant and trade in weed. He didn't commit big crimes, but he traded in weed and drugs, so nobody was surprised when he was arrested for the first time, and he was only 16 years old. The police saw him in the street and tried to ask him some questions, but he refused to cooperate and tried to escape. Shortly after, he was arrested again for weapon possession. Unfortunately, Reggie followed his brother's footsteps in this world, and most of his income was from selling weed. Until that time, although Reggie was indulged in the gangster world, he hadn't been involved yet in any violent conflicts. But then, after years, in 1995, when Reggie was 19 years old, he was arrested for murdering a man next to a well-known brothel in that area. Reggie was prosecuted, and the court found him guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison, and he was sent to Calipatria prison, one of the worst and most violent prisons in America. Reggie dressed in orange, which indicates that he is a new prisoner. Reggie, alongside other prisoners, boarded a bus that was going to take them to the prison. The bus kept driving in the streets until it left the city and took a road that seemed blocked, and there was nothing around. Reggie was looking through the bus window and saw nothing but desert. Shortly, he was finally able to see Calipatria prison from afar. It was a complex made up of several buildings and extended over a large area. It was in the middle of nowhere, as if it were a graveyard to which they send people who have been rejected by society, so that they can live the rest of their lives in isolation. Reggie was nervous since the bus left the court, and the closer the bus approached the prison, the more he got nervous. As soon as they crossed the first prison gate, the first thing Reggie noticed was the smell of dung that filled the place from the animal pen of the prison. Reggie lowered his head to his hands that were tied to the chair, trying to ignore the smell, but to no avail. the smell was pungent. Then the bus crossed a huge fence that surrounded the whole prison. This fence was electrified, and if anyone touched it, he would die immediately. Of course, all the prisoners knew this. Besides this electrified fence, there was an internal fence that was not electrified. But if you crossed the internal fence, you would find this huge electrified fence. Meaning, do not consider escaping from this prison through its fences. The goal of this fence was to let the guards focus on inside the prison, instead of focusing on the prison walls and parameters. Because the guards in this prison were few compared to the prisoners, they were 1 to 50, which means that every 50 prisoners had one guard. Just 3 months before Reggie entered the prison, there was a famous incident. 5 prisoners in this prison had a big fight with the guards that ended with the prisoners stabbing 8 guards. They stabbed them with knives they made inside the prison. None of the 8 guards died, but this incident was big news that spread throughout the state of California. Everyone heard about it. The bus that brought Reggie and the new prisoners arrived at the main building of the prison, and most of the old prisoners were in the outer yard of the prison, gazing at Reggie and the new prisoners. After the bus had stopped, one of the guards came out and started calling out to the new prisoners one by one from the list he had. Then, after that, the detainees were brought to the inspection room, where they were stripped completely naked to ensure that nothing was hidden on their bodies. After that, they gave them prison attire and took each prisoner to his own cell. The cells in this prison were like a grave. It had 4 walls and a cement ceiling with no windows, and even the door was made of a metal plate with a small opening in the middle that opened and closed from the outside. This cell had a double bed, a sink, and a toilet. Reggie entered the cell and started discovering the place, looking right and left, until he noticed a person sleeping on the bed below. This person was his cellmate. As soon as the latter saw Reggie turned his face to the other side, avoiding eye contact with him. Even though this cellmate was the person closest to him most of the time, Reggie did not know who he was, so he did not want to provoke him by mistake. He could be a dangerous person. Reggie was convinced that to survive in this place, he must avoid even talking with the other prisoners. When Reggie entered the cell, he avoided talking to his friend, and even without seeing him, he used the ladder to climb up to his bed and laid on his back and started gazing at the ceiling. From the first week in prison, Reggie knew how dangerous this place was and that to survive, he must be careful of everything and everyone. The first lesson Reggie learned was when a group of prisoners suddenly entered their cell, and his cellmate tried to welcome them and be nice to them, so they wouldn't hurt them. But these prisoners suddenly attacked him, beat him, and raped him, while Reggie was sleeping on his bed above trying to ignore the situation and pretending to be sleeping so that they wouldn't hurt him, because his cellmate didn't try to fight or resist them. This was repeated several times, and every time these prisoners broke into their cell and did the same thing to his cellmate, and every time Reggie tried to pretend to be sleeping and ignored the situation, although he was listening to what was happening. From that time, Reggie realized that he needed to fight to survive in this place. He noticed that many of the prisoners had handmade knives, which means they used normal things, but in one way or another, they turned them into knives and sharp things. So, he also had to make his knife. The only tool he had was his toothbrush. Using a stone, Reggie kept sharpening the tip of the brush until it became sharp and ready to be used in stabbing. So his toothbrush became his knife. Every day, the prisoners had the right to go out to the prison's outer yard. Reggie, while watching the situation, noticed that most of the prisoners were in gangs, and he felt that he would need to join a gang that would protect him and back him up. But the problem is that it was hard for new prisoners like him to join a gang immediately. They had to prove themselves first. Reggie started looking for a gang that was close to his original gang, with whom he had been working before being arrested. He tried to watch the situation from a distance without attracting anyone's attention. He knew that if he attracted others' attention, that would be like an execution sentence for him. Even though Reggie was trying to stay away from the problems as much as he could, One day, while he was walking in the prison yard, a group of prisoners suddenly trapped him. It was clear that they were a gang, and the biggest one of them, who seemed to be their leader, approached him, pulled his neck, and fixed him on the fence that was surrounding the outside yard. Reggie, while he was fixed on the fence, felt that the eyes of all the prisoners were on him. Every prisoner in the yard would know what happened there, and he remembered the torment that his cellmate was suffering. Therefore, he realized that if he didn't react at that moment, he would be suffering the same torment as his cellmate. Everyone would see him as an easy hunt, so he had to resist. With a sudden movement in the blink of an eye, Reggie took out his sharp toothbrush and stabbed the big man in his waist. The stab was not intended to kill him, because if he killed him, the guards would take severe measures against him, and he could even be sentenced to death later. The goal of the stab was to be a strike of intimidation and to prove himself to everyone. A message to everyone that Reggie is not an easy person that anyone can dare to attack. After the stab, the gang that was trapping him dispersed, and even the big man who was holding him retreated so as not to receive a second attack. Reggie's resistance made him classified as a dangerous person and began to have a reputation among the prisoners. After this incident, there was a gang called 49, welcomed Reggie so that he could join them. And here, Reggie had finally reached what he sought. A gang that he could join and protect his back, because it was the only way for him to survive in this place. Finally, he was able to make a place for himself in the middle of this jungle. Despite the large number of gangs inside Calipatria prison, all of these gangs were subject to one man, a man who positioned himself as the king of this place. The most violent and powerful prisoner in this prison is a very big man named Eddie Clark, and they dubbed him El Diablo, which means the devil in Spanish. For El Diablo, the prison was not only his home but his business too. There were smuggling operations of drugs and contraband that took place constantly inside this prison, and all of these smuggling operations were under the management of El Diablo. He set up a small drug empire for himself inside the prison. Everyone in this prison was afraid of him and tried to avoid his evil. Even the guards were confessing to his status and influence over this place, and they were giving him special privileges to maintain calm and peace. You would say all this is happening, and you would call it peace. Believe me, the situation could have been much worse. Every prisoner was inside this prison due to a murder case or a very violent case, so this place could turn into hell at any moment. And the guards were trying to preserve peace as much as they could, and their leniency with the El Diablo and granting him distinctions was part of the necessary concessions. In this way, El Diablo took full control over the prison, and no one dared to confront or object to him, neither the prisoners nor the guards. As for Reggie, he was comfortable with his new situation with his gang, and not only felt safe, but he even felt like he was a human being again. He could go out with his gang and play basketball, or they could sit in the yard and talk in complete safety. He had people around him that he trusted, people he felt had his back. And just like all the prisoners, Reggie knew that he should always avoid El Diablo and should never attract his attention. Everyone knew the story of El Diablo, who, although he was only 34 years old, spent 20 of his life in prison. Even when he was a teenager and entered the juvenile prison when he was 13 years old, he assaulted another teenager. He beat him until he died. He was a savage from a young age. After he turned 18 years old and got out of the juvenile prison, he returned to the world of gangs, and it did not take long until he was arrested again after he broke into an old woman's house, assaulted her, and killed her son, who tried to defend her in front of her. From that day, he was in prison for a life sentence. This means that this savage fully deserved his title. The problem was that El Diablo was moody and could even suddenly turn on his closest followers. No one was safe with him, and of course, since he was the king in this place, he always got what he wanted, no matter what the situation was. Over the next 2 years, Reggie lived a relatively quiet life in this prison. He stayed away from El Diablo and did not get into any problems or make enemies for himself. 4 years passed, and things were calm. During these 4 years, Reggie directed a lot of his effort and energy to exercise and strengthen his body and muscles, so he built himself a very good body. His strength has greatly increased. The emaciated teenager who entered this prison when he was 19 years old has become a 24-year-old young man with a strong muscular structure. Fortunately for him, he focused on building his muscles and body during these past years because he will need all of his strength for the upcoming events. Over time, El Diablo's situation has become worse. He became addicted to alcohol and was always drunk. And when violence and drunkenness are mixed, they will give you a result worse than anything you can imagine. Even those closest to El Diablo have become afraid of him. Just one wrong look from one of them could make El Diablo hit him, stab him, or even rape him. The situation of this savage devil was becoming more and more crazy every day, and although Reggie had succeeded in avoiding him for the past 4 years, fate would bring him into direct confrontation with him. In October of 2000, the prisoners were in the outer yard, and one of them took a pebble and threw it on the back of one of the guards. The guards immediately ordered all the prisoners in the yard to lie down on the ground to search them. During the search, one of the guards saw a handmade knife that the prisoners use, thrown on the floor. Maybe one of the prisoners threw it before the search so that they would not discover that he had it. The guards did not know that the knife belonged to El Diablo's cellmate, who was his closest assistant and most trusted person. The guard raised the knife and asked the prisoners, "Who owns this knife?" None of the prisoners spoke a word, although many of them knew who this knife was for, because if any of them spoke, it would be as if he had condemned himself to death. And all of them knew that El Diablo was going to do something to protect his assistant and close friend. At that moment, El Diablo himself was lying on the ground with the other prisoners. He raised his head and began to look around among the prisoners, looking for someone whom he could accuse. By coincidence, his eyes fell on Reggie, who was performing a painting task in the outer yard, because the prison administration used to allow the prisoners to do manual maintenance work inside the prison. So they assigned Reggie the task of painting one of the walls of the prison's outer yard. Reggie was lying on the ground like the rest of the prisoners, with paintbrushes in his hand. He felt the moment when the eyes of El Diablo fell on him, and he knew that he was intending to do him bad. El Diablo raised his hand and pointed at Reggie and said to the guards, This one is the owner of the knife." In the few seconds that followed, Reggie's mind began to imagine the future and make his calculations. If they added a weapon possession charge to his sentence, this would not affect him, because he was already sentenced to life. Nothing would be changed. But the thing that would be affected is his status and reputation among the prisoners. And as soon as he submits to the charge that El Diablo falsely imposed on him, everyone will see him as a weak person. He would become a target again, and the remaining prisoners would consider him an easy prey, and many of them would dare him. At that moment, Reggie knew that just as he had stood up to the giant prisoner who tried to attack him in the first week, he must now stand up to Calipatria prison's devil. As soon as the guards asked Reggie about the knife, his answer was, "No, it's not mine." It was just a short sentence and a few words, but it would change his life forever. And now, Reggie had officially become the declared enemy in front of everyone for El Diablo. Everyone was shocked after this sentence came out of Reggie's mouth, even the guards. Everyone was wondering how dare this crazy confronted El Diablo. Reggie did not face El Diablo after that, but he knew the situation he was in. He knew he had become El Diablo's enemy. During the weeks that followed this incident, Reggie was always in a state of alert. He was expecting that El Diablo or one of his assistants might attack him at any moment. Even when he was sleeping on his bed at night, he was unable to sleep comfortably. And every time he went out to the outside yard during his break, he kept his eyes on El Diablo and his close assistants and tried to stay away from him as much as he could, and tried to stay next to the guards or in a place where their eyes would be on him. so that he would not be trapped by El Diablo and his group. But a month later, in November 2000, one day Reggie was walking in the outer yard and noticed that El Diablo was coming towards him. He was not even trying to surprise him or walk stealthily. He was coming straight at him. Reggie didn't know what to do, and El Diablo kept getting closer until he got in front of him and held Reggie's shoulder with his left hand and stabbed his waist with the right. It wasn't a fatal stab, but it was a painful message. A message that says that the days of Reggie in this prison are numbered. As he pulled the knife from Reggie, he threw the knife in the grass and walked away. Reggie put his hand on the place of the stab as he was bleeding, and none of the prisoners who saw what happened tried to help him. They all looked away as if they didn't see anything. Even the guards, none of them tried to intervene. Reggie kept pressing on his wound to reduce the amount of blood that came out. A quarter later, the bell rang, which indicated the end of the break, and all the prisoners had to go back to their cells. But before, they all lined up at the gate to be searched. The guards searched them to check if they had weapons or contrabands they were trying to smuggle to their cells. It was a routine search that they always do after the break. All the prisoners were lined up. El Diablo was at the front, and Reggie was 3 or 4 prisoners away behind him. Reggie was still pressing on his wound and trying to hide it from the guards. But the wound was not the only thing that Reggie tried to hide. He was also hiding his knife that he took from the outer yard. He had buried a knife in a hole and hidden it carefully so he could use it when he needed it. A few minutes before leaving the yard, he took out the knife and stood in line, waiting for his turn in the search, with the knife in his pocket. El Diablo, who was in the front of the search line, arrived at the guard, who started searching him from the front, and then asked him to turn around so he could search him from the back. When El Diablo turned his back to be searched, he was looking at the prisoners who were standing behind him, and Reggie was standing in the line among them. El Diablo was looking at him with contempt and a sarcastic smile. While the guard was still searching, suddenly, Reggie, who was holding his wound, got out of the line and quickly ran towards El Diablo, raised his hand with which he was holding the knife, and stabbed El Diablo in the throat. Everyone was frozen in place, unable to believe what happened in front of their eyes. El Diablo opened his eyes with a look of shock. This look of shock quickly turned into a look of pain, and his huge body retreated. The knife came out of his throat, and with his hands he was trying to stop the bleeding by holding his neck. But the problem was that he was suffocating and unable to breathe. Everything happened in a few seconds, during which El Diablo fell on the ground, writhing in pain, and before the guards could move or do any reaction, Reggie laid down on the ground and put his hands above his head in a clear sign of surrender, saying and shouting, "I know what I did. I know what I did, trying to prove to the guards that he wouldn't expose others' lives to danger, and that his only target was El Diablo." Reggie was arrested immediately by the guards and put in solitary confinement. The whole prison was in a state of alert that night. El Diablo's death could lead to a huge mess in the prison, so all prisoners were locked up in their cells and forbidden from leaving for any reason. Reggie now faces his second murder crime, which means that if he was tried, there was a high probability that he would be executed, and there was not almost any chance for Reggie to avoid being convicted of this crime. Everyone saw what happened, and he admitted it. The only thing that could save him was to say that he committed this crime in defense of himself, and this was relatively true. But even if he succeeded in convincing the judge that this was in defense of himself, and even if he was able to avoid being sentenced to death, he would be sentenced to at least 10 years in solitary confinement. Reggie was very pessimist to the point that he was seeing the future ahead dark, even when they presented him with a list of lawyers who were appointed by the state, and who could represent him for free in court. He didn't think much about the matter, and chose any lawyer from the list randomly, because he thought that in the end, the result would be the same. But his belief was very wrong. The random lawyer he chose, Christopher Blort, would do something he was not even dreaming of. This lawyer Christopher would discover something that would change everything. Everything had started when he began to delve into the files of the original case because of which Reggie was imprisoned. The murder case that took place in 1994 in front of a brothel. The victim in this was a 29-year-old man named Felipe Gonzalez. When two police officers arrived at the crime scene, they were a male and a female officer. These two officers were able to find the manager of that brothel, whose name was John Jones, and they arrested him for questioning because brothels are illegal. John Jones became the main witness in the case, and according to his words, he saw everything that happened that night from the second floor of the brothel. The victim, Felipe Gonzalez, came to the brothel, stopped his car, got off, and knocked on the door of the brothel. He asked to meet a certain person, but they told him that the person he was looking for was not there. After that, Felipe returned to his car, and suddenly 3 armed teenagers approached him. It was clear from their appearance that they were members of a gang, and they asked him to give them money. But Felipe Gonzalez did not speak in English. He did not understand them. Suddenly, these 3 teenagers shot him dead, and they ran away through one of the alleys. John Jones said that he noticed one of these teenagers limping while they were running away, so he assumed that he was shot during the attack, either by one of his friends, or maybe he shot himself by accident. The police officer who was responsible for this case, this was her first crime case, so she began to look for criminals that were arrested for other cases in the same area where the crime took place. One of these criminals was Reggie. Reggie was 19 years old at the time, and as it was mentioned before, he was working with a gang selling weed. And on top of that, he was shot in the leg. He was in accordance with the descriptions that John described of the teenagers who killed Felipe Gonzalez. Based on this, Reggie was accused of murder, and he was sentenced and imprisoned. As the lawyer delved into the files of this case, he found many things that would take away the accusation of Reggie. Imagine that it took him 3 years to prove that Reggie had nothing to do with this crime, the crime based on which he was sent to prison. And the lawyer proved with scientific evidence that Felipe Gonzalez, the victim who was killed, was shot from a high place because the angle of entry of the bullets into his body was as if they were coming from above. This means that it is impossible for the person who shot him to have been standing at the same level as the street where he was shot. The shot came from one of the neighboring houses from an upper floor. It could be from the window of the brothel manager, John, who claimed that he saw the teenagers shooting Felipe Gonzalez, which means maybe John is the killer. Moreover, there were no fingerprints or DNA at the crime scene or witnesses indicating that Reggie was the criminal. Even John, the manager of the brothel, later retracted his testimony and said that he told the police what they wanted to hear in exchange for letting him run the brothel that are illegal in America. But the biggest thing of all this evidence, and what the lawyer discovered, is that the wound on Reggie's leg, for which he was accused, was a bullet wound, but it was an old wound. Reggie was hit by the bullet when he was 13 years old, meaning 5 years ago before the crime he was accused of. And it is certain that when the police saw this wound, they knew that it was an old wound and that Reggie was not even limping. But it was clear that this police officer who was responsible for this case wanted to close it quickly. As we said, this was her first crime case, so she wanted to register a victory in her record as soon as possible. She saw that this poor Reggie was a gang member, so she simply accused him. Although Reggie kept telling them that he was innocent for a long time, eventually he was convicted of it. After Reggie had been imprisoned, he spent a long time in the prison library looking up the law books about the false charges. Even during the prison period, Reggie was trying to get away from violence and problems, but the problems were coming after him. He was forced to defend himself and try to survive in this environment in which he was accused of a crime he didn't commit. Imagine that the lawyer had been working on this case for 3 years. During these years, Reggie was in solitary confinement after he had killed El Diablo, and then the lawyer took the case to court again. Finally, the judge ruled that Reggie was innocent of the first crime of which he was accused. As for the murder of El Diablo, they reduced the charges from the crime of first-degree murder to the crime of second-degree murder. and they sentenced Reggie to 10 years in solitary confinement in connection with El Diablo murder. This case took a long time, and by the time the sentence was ruled, Reggie had already spent 8 years in solitary confinement, and these 8 years were counted within the sentence, so he had only 2 years left to get released. After Reggie had completed the last 2 years of his sentence, he finally got out of prison in 2009. After spending 16 years in prison, 10 of them were in solitary confinement. And although he went through hard times, but he was happy with his freedom. After being released, Reggie entered a long judicial battle to regain his rights. And finally, in 2017, Los Angeles paid Reggie a compensation of $5.2 million. Of course, these millions will not compensate him for what he went through while imprisoned, but at least it will make him live a comfortable life for the rest of his life, financially speaking. We have come to the end of our story. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video. Goodbye.